The men who disappeared at Black Spruce Cabin. Location: Interior, Alaska. Approximate year: August 2019. I am 45 now. 7 summers ago, 4 men disappeared from an old exploration cabin in the Alaskan interior. Search crews eventually found part of one of them. His left leg was lying in wet grass behind a collapsed generator shed, still inside his boot. The separation was so clean that one of the state troopers later told me it looked less like an injury and more like something from an anatomy textbook. There was almost no blood around it. The rest of Curtis Lane was never found. Neither were Nate Bell, Roy Jensen, or Miguel Santos. I was the 5th man who spent that night at Black Spruce Cabin. I am the only one who came back. By the summer of 2019, I had been working as a field geologist for long enough that remote assignments no longer felt adventurous. They were work. We collected rock samples, mapped old claims, checked mineralized zones identified from aerial surveys, and spent days walking through country that looked impressive on satellite imagery and mostly consisted of mosquitoes, wet boots, alder, and rocks when you were actually standing in it. That August, a small exploration company out of Anchorage hired our crew to inspect several old prospects east of the Alaska Range. There had been activity there in the 70s and early 80s, but very little since. Old records mentioned quartz veins, minor gold values, and elevated arsenic in stream sediment. Nothing that would make anyone rich, just enough to justify sending 5 people into the field for 6 days. Our team leader was Nate Bell. Nate was 46, careful, experienced, and almost irritatingly difficult to surprise. If Nate told you the weather was safe, he had already checked 3 forecasts. Curtis Lane was our equipment technician. Roy Jensen handled logistics and sampling. Miguel Santos managed GPS data and field mapping. I handled structural measurements and documentation. We carried a satellite phone, 2 satellite messengers, GPS units, first aid kits, bear spray, a 12-gauge shotgun, emergency food, water filters, rain gear, and enough equipment to make getting lost embarrassing. I mention that because when people hear what happened, they usually look for the easiest explanation. Bad preparation, alcohol, drugs, 5 inexperienced men panicking in the wilderness. That was not us. A bush plane dropped us beside an abandoned gravel strip on the morning of August 23rd. The weather was warm for that part of Alaska, around 60 degrees, cloudy but dry. Fireweed still grew purple along the open ground, and the lower country was dense with willow, alder, and black spruce. From the landing strip, we followed the remains of an old mining road north. Parts of it were still obvious. Other sections had almost disappeared into brush. The first day was completely normal. We sampled 2 creek exposures, camped beside a gravel bar, cooked dinner, complained about mosquitoes, and went to sleep while there was still a little light over the western ridges. The next morning, Nate showed us an old survey map. Our route toward the second prospect passed close to a cabin built during exploration work in 1977. Later crews had used it occasionally. A report from 2012 described the structure as weathered but sound. Roof intact, door intact, bunks inside. There was also supposed to be an old outhouse and a small generator shed. The cabin sat almost exactly where we intended to stop for the night. There was a chance of heavy rain after midnight. Sleeping under a roof sounded better than setting tents in wet brush. So we changed the plan. The first few hours were ordinary. Then, sometime after lunch, the forest became quiet. I noticed because the mosquitoes disappeared. That sounds like a good thing until it happens all at once. For most of the morning, they had been everywhere, around our faces, inside our cuffs, following us whenever we stopped. Then I realized I had not slapped at one in several minutes. A little later, I noticed the birds were gone too. No ravens, no chickadees, no distant woodpecker, nothing moving through the brush. Even the breeze seemed to have stopped. The 5 of us were following a narrow drainage through spruce and willow when I stopped walking. Miguel nearly bumped into my pack. "What?" I listened. "I don't hear anything." He smiled at first. Then he listened too. Roy, who was behind him, laughed. "Enjoy it. Maybe the mosquitoes finally got tired of us." Nate looked up into the trees. He did not say anything. We continued. A northern forest can become quiet. Weather changes, animals move, bird activity rises and falls. There was nothing supernatural about silence. I knew that. But after another mile, I began experiencing a sensation I have never been able to describe properly. It felt as though someone else had joined us, not someone I could hear, not someone I could see. Just the persistent impression that our group was larger than it should have been. 5 men would stop. Something else seemed to stop. We would start walking again. The feeling moved with us. Every few minutes, I looked back. There was never anyone there, only the narrow path we had pushed through the brush. Wet leaves, spruce trunks, dark ground beneath the trees. Once I thought I saw a branch moving 30 or 40 yards behind us. I watched it until it became still. No animal appeared. I told myself a piece of alder had sprung back after Roy's pack brushed against it. That explanation worked, for maybe 10 minutes. We reached the cabin shortly after 6. The old survey maps called the place Camp 21, but someone had nailed a small wooden board beside the door years later. Black Spruce cabin had been burned into it by hand. The cabin stood in a shallow clearing above the drainage. The logs were dark with age. The metal roof was rusted but intact. There were 2 small windows and a heavy wooden door. 20 yards behind it stood an outhouse. Farther downhill, brush had grown through what remained of the generator shed. Curtis walked around the building first. No bear damage. Nate checked the chimney, even though we had no reason to use the stove unless the rain made the night unusually cold. I went inside with Miguel. The cabin smelled of dry timber, old smoke, dust, and something faintly sour that I assumed came from mice. There were 4 wooden bunks, 2 against each wall, and a narrow cot beside the window. A table stood near the center. An old iron stove occupied one corner. Someone had left canned food, a broken lantern, and several paperback novels on a shelf. On one of the walls, previous visitors had written names and dates in pencil. 1988, 1994, 2003, 2012. Nothing strange. We checked the bunks for droppings, brought our packs inside, and cooked dinner on our own camp stove outside the door. By 8, clouds had thickened over the mountains. The evening light went gray. Miguel sent our coordinates through one of the satellite messengers. Nate made the scheduled call to Anchorage and told the office we were spending the night at the cabin. That call later became one of the most important facts in the search. People knew exactly where we were. Nobody had to guess. We sat outside for another hour. Curtis told a story about a drilling crew near Nome that had lost an entire pallet of sample bags because someone forgot to close the helicopter cargo net. Roy accused him of being the person who forgot. Curtis denied it. Miguel laughed hard enough to spill coffee onto his pants. Those are the memories I try to keep. Not what happened later, those ordinary hours. 5 men sitting outside an old cabin while daylight slowly faded behind the trees. Around 10:30, the first drops of rain began hitting the roof. We went inside. Nobody lit the wood stove. The cabin was warm enough. We opened the vent above the door and used 2 battery lanterns while we organized equipment for the morning. By 11:30, everyone was tired. Nate and Miguel took the bunks along the far wall. Roy took the lower bunk opposite them. Curtis climbed into the bunk above Roy. I took the narrow cot beside the window. 1 lantern remained on the table at its lowest setting. The rain became steady. For a while, hearing it on the metal roof actually made me feel better. The forest was no longer completely silent. I remember Curtis snoring. I remember Roy telling him to roll over. I remember Nate saying something about leaving early if the rain stopped before dawn. Then I fell asleep. Sometime later, I woke up. I had no idea what time it was. The lantern on the table had gone out. The rain had weakened to a soft tapping against the roof. For a few seconds, I simply lay there. Then I heard Curtis climbing down from the bunk. The floor creaked under his weight. I heard him put on his boots. Then the door opened. He stepped outside. The door closed. I assumed he was going to the outhouse. I turned toward the wall. A minute or two passed. Then I heard footsteps. They were coming through the wet grass beside the cabin. Slow, heavy enough that I assumed they belonged to Curtis. The footsteps moved past the wall behind my head. Then they stopped directly outside the window beside my cot. 3 quiet taps touched the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I opened my eyes. My first thought was that Curtis was trying to scare me. He had spent most of the evening making jokes. I nearly turned toward the window. Something stopped me. To this day, I cannot explain what. I stayed facing the wall. 3 more taps came from the glass. Tap, 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 exactly the same rhythm. I waited for Curtis to laugh. Nothing. Then the footsteps began again. They moved toward the front of the cabin. The door latch lifted, very slowly. The hinges gave a soft creak. The door opened. Cool, damp air entered the room. Then the door closed. I waited for Curtis to walk back to his bunk. There were no footsteps. The cabin floor was impossible to cross silently. Even shifting your weight made those old boards complain. I listened. Nothing. I could hear rain dripping from the roof. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric when I moved one hand beneath my blanket. But there was no sound from Curtis. I told myself I must have drifted halfway back to sleep. Maybe I had missed him climbing into bed. It was the only explanation I had. So I turned over. I wish I had not. There are pieces of the next few seconds that remain perfectly clear. The table. The dark rectangle of the doorway. A strip of gray light at the window. The outline of the old iron stove. A water bottle lying on its side beneath Roy's bunk. I remember all of those things. What I cannot remember properly is what occupied the space between them. I know something was inside the cabin. I know I looked directly at it. But the memory will not remain whole. That is not a dramatic way of saying I refuse to describe it. I have tried, for years. I remember an impression of something too high, and then immediately become uncertain that height had anything to do with it. I remember thinking part of it was close to the floor. Sometimes I think I saw a face. Sometimes I am certain there was nothing there that should be called a face. The harder I try to reconstruct it, the more the memory breaks into unrelated pieces. Doctors later called that a trauma response. Maybe they were right. What I remember clearly is everything around it. Curtis's bunk was empty. That was not surprising. He had gone outside. Roy's bunk was empty too. So were Nate's and Miguel's. Their blankets were still there. Their boots were still beside the bunks. And something was between me and the door. Whatever I saw created one thought so immediate that I did not reason my way toward it. Get out! That is the last complete memory I have from inside Black Spruce cabin. The next thing I remember is running. I was in the forest. Rain was falling hard. I had no boots, no jacket, no flashlight. I was wearing a t-shirt, lightweight sleep pants, and socks. I have no memory of opening the cabin door, no memory of crossing the clearing, no memory of deciding which direction to go. I was simply running. Branches hit my face. Alder tore at my clothes. Wet ground slipped beneath my feet. I fell again and again. Each time I got back up. I never looked behind me. That part is absolute. Whatever I had seen in the cabin had left one instruction in my mind, stronger than pain, fear, or common sense. Do not turn around. Nothing chased me. That is what frightened me most. I heard no footsteps behind me, no branches breaking, no breathing, no voice calling my name. Only rain. And underneath it, that same feeling from the afternoon. Something knew where I was. It did not need to run. At some point, I crossed the drainage and fell down an embankment. My right shoulder struck a rock. I heard something crack. Later, doctors told me I had fractured my collarbone. I kept moving. The soles of my socks were gone by then. My feet were cut badly enough that I was leaving blood on rocks, though I did not feel much of it at the time. Eventually, I reached an old service road. I recognized the drainage ditch and the remains of wooden culverts from the map. I turned downhill. After that, my memories become scattered. Rain, gray sky, walking, crawling for a while because my ankle would no longer support me. Then nothing. A telecommunications contractor found me shortly after 9 the next morning. He was driving an ATV toward a microwave repeater several miles down the road. I was lying partly in the ditch. He later told police I was conscious, but barely. I kept asking him whether anything had followed me out of the trees. I remember none of that. I was flown to Fairbanks. I had a broken collarbone, a severe ankle sprain, multiple cuts, mild hypothermia from spending the night soaked in the rain, and a concussion. None of those injuries explained what had happened to the others. Our Anchorage office reported the crew overdue that morning after Nate failed to make the scheduled satellite check-in. Because he had given them the cabin coordinates the previous evening, the search focused there immediately. A helicopter reached the clearing before noon. The rain had stopped. Inside the cabin, almost everything remained exactly where we had left it. Our packs, food, sampling equipment, GPS units, the shotgun, satellite phone, both satellite messengers. My boots were beside the cot. Nate's boots were beside his bunk. So were Roy's and Miguel's. Their rain jackets were hanging from pegs near the door. Curtis's boots were gone. So was the light jacket he had worn when he stepped outside. There was no sign of a fight, no overturned table, no broken furniture, no bullet damage, no large amount of blood. The rescuers initially assumed the 4 men had gone outside to look for me. That would have made sense, except 3 of them appeared to have gone barefoot or in socks. And none had taken a flashlight, radio, rain jacket, bear spray, or weapon. Heavy rain during the night had turned the clearing to mud and washed away most useful tracks. Searchers could still see disturbed areas near the cabin, but there were too many overlapping impressions to determine who had gone where. My own route could be followed intermittently because I had broken branches and left blood in several places. There was no comparable trail for the others. Then one of the searchers checked behind the collapsed generator shed. That was where they found Curtis's leg. It lay in flattened grass about 30 yards from the cabin. The boot was still tied. His sock was still inside it. The leg had been separated above the knee. There were no animal bites, no tearing that suggested a bear, no obvious drag marks. And despite the rain, investigators expected at least some evidence of major blood loss nearby. They found almost none. DNA later confirmed it belonged to Curtis. The condition of the separation became one of the strangest parts of the investigation. One examiner believed some type of powered cutting equipment might have been involved, but we had carried nothing capable of making that kind of cut. The old generator shed contained no machinery. The generator itself had been removed decades earlier. Another investigator told me privately that he could not identify conventional saw marks. I once asked a state trooper what he thought had happened. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I can tell you what didn't do it. A bear didn't do that." Search teams remained in the area for 9 days. Helicopters flew the valleys. Dogs worked the old roads. Ground teams searched creeks, ravines, abandoned prospect pits, and every structure marked on historic surveys. They found nothing else. No clothes, no equipment, no blood trail, no bodies. Nate Bell, Roy Jensen, and Miguel Santos simply disappeared. Officially, investigators considered several possibilities: an animal encounter, a violent dispute inside the group, disorientation caused by darkness and weather. They even considered whether someone else had been living illegally in the area. None of those theories fit everything. A bear could make men run. It could not explain why 3 experienced field workers left without boots, lights, jackets, radios, or bear protection. A stranger could hurt someone. But there was no evidence another camp existed anywhere nearby, and nobody could explain Curtis's leg. Then they questioned me. I told them about the silence during the hike, the feeling that someone was following us, Curtis leaving the cabin, the footsteps, the tapping on the window, the door opening. Then they asked what I saw when I turned around. I tried to answer. My heart rate climbed until the monitor beside my hospital bed started alarming. My hands shook so badly I could not hold a cup. According to the nurse, I stopped speaking and stared at the wall for almost a minute. The same thing happened during a later interview. After that, they stopped pushing. For several weeks, I remained in Fairbanks recovering. My collarbone began healing. My feet were stitched and bandaged. The concussion symptoms faded. But every night I dreamed about the cabin. Never about what I had seen. Even in the dreams, that part remained missing. I dreamed about the window. 3 taps, always 3. Then the door opening. And no footsteps afterward. About 2 months after the disappearance, I was back in Anchorage for physical therapy. One evening, I was sitting beside the window in my second-floor room. The sun had already gone down. Cars moved through the parking lot below. Beyond the lights was a narrow strip of spruce separating the building from another road. I noticed someone standing between the trees. A man. At least I thought it was a man. He was too far away to identify. He did not move. I watched him for maybe 10 seconds. A nurse entered. I turned my head to answer her. When I looked back, nobody was there. I told myself it was someone waiting for a ride. The next morning, another nurse raised the blind and noticed something resting on the exterior window ledge. The window was sealed. It did not open. Maintenance eventually reached the ledge from outside. What they recovered was part of a human finger. Police assumed it was some kind of grotesque prank. Then the DNA results came back. It belonged to Miguel Santos. Miguel had been missing for almost 2 months. No other part of him was ever recovered. The ledge was more than 20 feet above the ground. Security cameras covered the parking lot and the main approaches to that side of the building. Investigators reviewed the footage. Nobody climbed beneath my room. No ladder appeared. No vehicle stopped there during the relevant period. Nobody ever explained how the tissue reached the ledge. That detail was never widely released. Miguel's disappearance was still an active investigation. His family wanted privacy. The hospital refused to discuss it, and I wanted nothing to do with reporters. I left Alaska the following year. I still work in geology, but from an office now. I review survey data, drilling reports, and maps. I got married. I have a daughter. For several years, nothing else happened. No tapping, no figures outside windows, no pieces of anyone. Gradually, I managed to convince myself that whatever happened was tied to that place. Black Spruce cabin, that drainage, that particular patch of forest. Then last month, my phone rang at 2:13 in the morning. I slept through it. The number was blocked. There was a voicemail, 22 seconds long. For the first 14 seconds, there was only faint static. Then came 3 sounds, tap, 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 on glass. After that, someone breathed close to the microphone. Then I heard Curtis. He said one word. Not my real name. A nickname. It came from a stupid mistake I had made on the first afternoon of that trip. Roy invented it. Miguel repeated it. By dinner, all 4 men were using it. It never followed me home. Nobody in my family knew it. I never mentioned it to investigators. It appeared in no report or newspaper story. Only 5 people had ever heard it. 4 disappeared at Black Spruce cabin. I listened to the recording once. I have not played it again. The cabin is still standing. After receiving the voicemail, I checked recent satellite imagery. The clearing is visible. So is the dark roof. There are no active exploration claims in that drainage now. No field camps, no maintained hiking trail, nothing that should bring people there. But eventually someone will go. A hunter, A survey crew, someone caught in heavy rain who finds the old cabin marked on a map and decides a roof is safer than sleeping outside. Maybe they will cook dinner. Maybe they will complain about mosquitoes. Maybe the woods around them will slowly become quiet. And sometime after midnight, one of them may wake up. Someone will leave the cabin. Footsteps will move around the outside wall. 3 taps will touch the glass. The door will open. And whoever is lying nearest the window will eventually turn around. People still ask me what I saw. I cannot tell them. I have stopped trying to recover that part of the memory. But I remember one thought very clearly. Earlier that afternoon, when the mosquitoes vanished and every bird went silent, we assumed the animals had moved away from that part of the forest. I do not believe that anymore. I think they were still there, I think they were hiding, and I think they knew before we did that something had started following us. This was the second story from 6 collections. Stay tuned to Mystic Wilds. To be continued.